The night Natalie Morgan was dragged from her father's ranch changed everything, though she would not know until later that it also brought her the greatest love she would ever know. The summer of 1878 had been brutal in Fort Collins, Colorado, with the heat pressing down on the plains like a heavy blanket and tensions running high between ranchers and the scattered bands of outlaws who plagued the territory. Natalie had just turned 20 that spring, a woman with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and eyes the color of storm clouds. She had been helping her father run the ranch since her mother passed 2 years prior, learning to handle accounts and manage the hands with a firm but fair touch that earned respect from even the most weathered cowboys. That particular evening, she had been in the main house going over the ledgers by lamplight, while her father met with some of the ranch hands in the bunkhouse to discuss moving the cattle to better grazing land. The windows were open to catch any hint of breeze, and she could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the occasional whinny from the horses in the corral. She had just dipped her pen in ink when she heard the thunder of hooves approaching fast, too fast, and far too many riders for it to be anything good. Natalie rose from her chair and moved to the window, her heart already beginning to pound. Through the darkness, she could make out at least 6 riders, their faces covered with bandanas, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they charged toward the house. She heard shouting from the direction of the bunkhouse, then gunfire, sharp cracks that split the night air and sent ice through her veins. She ran for the rifle her father kept by the door, but she was not fast enough. The front door burst open with a crash of splintering wood, and 2 men rushed in. One was tall and lean, with eyes that glinted with something cruel, the other shorter and stockier with a scar running down the side of his face. Natalie grabbed for the rifle, but the tall one was on her in seconds, wrenching the weapon from her hands and throwing it across the room. "Well, well," he said, his voice rough and mocking. "Looks like we found ourselves a prize." "Let me go," Natalie said, trying to keep her voice steady even as fear coursed through her. "My father will kill you for this." The man with the scar laughed, a harsh sound. "Your father and his men are a little busy right now, sweetheart, and by the time they sort themselves out, we will be long gone." They grabbed her arms, and she fought with everything she had, kicking and clawing, but they were too strong. They dragged her out into the night where the other riders waited, and she could see flames beginning to lick at the barn, smoke rising into the dark sky. She screamed for her father, struggling against the hands that held her, but one of the men produced a length of rope and bound her wrists tightly in front of her. "Somebody shut her up," one of the riders called out, a man with a graying beard who seemed to be leading the group. The tall outlaw pulled a bandana from his pocket and tied it around her mouth, muffling her cries. They lifted her onto a horse, and the man with the scar swung up behind her, keeping one arm locked around her waist. The riders took off at a gallop, heading north into the darkness, and Natalie could only watch helplessly as her home disappeared behind them, the orange glow of the burning barn fading into the distance. They rode hard through the night, and Natalie lost track of time as the horse pounded beneath her and the landscape blurred past. Her wrists ached from the rope, and her jaw hurt from the gag, but worse than the physical discomfort was the terror that gripped her heart. She had heard stories of what happened to women taken by outlaws, none of them good. She thought of her father, prayed that he was unharmed, and wondered if anyone would come looking for her, or if she would simply vanish into the wild territories, never to be seen again. Miles away in Fort Collins, Wyatt Fletcher had been finishing up a game of cards at the saloon when word reached town about the attack on the Morgan ranch. Wyatt was 24, a cowboy who had been working various ranches in the territory for the past 6 years, moving from place to place as work demanded. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair and blue eyes that could be warm as summer sky or cold as winter ice depending on his mood. He had a reputation as a fair man, but not one to cross, handy with both a rope and a gun, and known for keeping his word once he gave it. He had met Natalie Morgan only twice before, once when he had delivered some horses to her father's ranch, and again at a church social in town. Both times he had been struck by her intelligence and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. She had not been like the other young women in Fort Collins, giggling and putting on airs. She had looked him directly in the eye when they spoke, asking thoughtful questions about the horses and the trails he had ridden, and he had found himself thinking about her more often than he probably should have. When he heard that she had been taken, something fierce and protective surged up in him, a feeling so strong it almost surprised him. He left the saloon immediately, not bothering to collect his winnings, and headed to the general store where he knew the owner would still be taking inventory. He bought supplies quickly, ammunition and dried beef in a canteen, then went to the livery to saddle his horse, a strong roan gelding named Red, who had carried him faithfully across half the territory. By the time he rode out to the Morgan ranch, it was past midnight. The barn was still smoldering, and several ranch hands were working to contain the damage while others tended to the wounded. Wyatt found Nathan Morgan in the main house, his arm bandaged and his face gray with worry and rage. "Mr. Morgan," Wyatt said, removing his hat as he entered, "I heard what happened. I am going after them." Nathan looked up, and for a moment recognition flickered in his eyes. "Fletcher, is not it? You brought those horses a few months back." "Yes, sir." "This is not your fight, son. I have sent 2 of my best men already, and I will be riding out myself as soon as the dock clears me." Wyatt shook his head. "With respect, sir, you are hurt, and your men are needed here. I am a tracker, been following trails since I was 15. I can move faster alone, and I know this territory well enough. Let me bring her back." Nathan studied him for a long moment, and Wyatt could see the desperation warring with pride in the older man's eyes. Finally, Nathan nodded. They headed north, 6 of them, led by a man named Pike Garrison. He has a hideout somewhere in the mountains, but nobody has ever found it. They are dangerous men, Fletcher. I understand. If you bring my daughter back safe, I will owe you a debt I can never repay. Wyatt settled his hat back on his head. Just have some coffee ready when we get back, sir. That will be payment enough. He rode out within the hour, following the trail by moonlight. The outlaws had not bothered to hide their tracks, confident in their head start, and Wyatt pushed Red hard, stopping only briefly to let the horse rest and drink from a stream. As dawn broke over the plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, he could see the tracks were still fresh. The outlaws had not stopped for the night, which meant they were heading for somewhere specific, somewhere they felt safe. Natalie's first day as a captive passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. The outlaws rode relentlessly, stopping only twice to water the horses and allow the men to relieve themselves. They left her bound and gagged, though they gave her water, one of them holding the canteen to her lips while she drank greedily. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive, they finally began to slow, entering the foothills where pine trees offered some shade and the terrain grew more rugged. By late afternoon, they reached what appeared to be their destination, a canyon hidden among the rocks with a small cabin tucked into the cliff face and a corral for the horses. The outlaws dismounted, clearly relieved to have reached safety, and the man with the scar pulled Natalie down from the horse, keeping a firm grip on her arm as he led her toward the cabin. Inside, the cabin was sparse and dirty, with a few bunks along one wall, a rough table and chairs, and a fireplace that looked like it had not been cleaned in years. They pushed her down onto one of the chairs and finally removed the gag, and Natalie gasped for breath, working her jaw to ease the ache. "Please," she said, her voice hoarse, "just let me go. My father will pay you whatever you want." The leader, Pike Garrison, laughed as he poured himself a drink from a bottle on the table. He was in his 40s with a hard face and cold eyes. "Oh, we're counting on that, darling, but we are going to make him sweat a bit first. Let him worry about what might be happening to his pretty daughter. Makes folks more generous, you know." "You are making a mistake," Natalie said, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "The law will come after you." "The law?" Pike shook his head. "Nearest marshal is 3 days' ride from here, and by the time your daddy convinces anyone to come looking, we will have our money and be long gone. You just sit tight and behave yourself, and maybe you will get out of this in one piece." They tied her to the chair, ignoring her protests, and then the men settled in, passing around the bottle and talking in low voices about how much ransom they would demand. Natalie listened, her mind racing. She had to find a way to escape, or at least to leave some kind of trail if anyone came looking. But tied as she was, with 6 armed men watching, her options were desperately limited. As night fell, they gave her some stale bread and more water, and then they untied her from the chair long enough to let her lie down on one of the bunks, though they kept her wrists bound. She lay in the darkness, listening to the men snoring and the crackle of the dying fire, and tried not to let despair overwhelm her. Someone would come, she told herself. Her father would not abandon her. She just had to survive long enough to be found. Wyatt reached the foothills by dawn of the second day, having ridden through the night with only brief stops to rest Red. The trail was still clear, and he could tell he was gaining on them. The outlaws had slowed once they entered the hills, no longer pushing their horses as hard, and that gave him the advantage. He was careful to stay far enough back that they would not spot him, using the cover of trees and rocks to conceal his approach. By midday he had found the canyon, spotting the cabin from a ridge above. He counted 6 horses in the corral and saw smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. He settled down behind a boulder to watch and wait, studying the layout and trying to determine the best approach. Going in with guns blazing would likely get both him and Natalie killed. He needed to be smart about this, patient. He watched as the outlaws moved in and out of the cabin, taking turns standing guard and tending to the horses. He looked for any sign of Natalie, but did not see her, which he hoped meant she was inside and unharmed. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, he formulated a plan. It was risky, but everything about this situation was risky. He would wait until after dark, when most of the men would be asleep, and then he would make his move. Inside the cabin, Natalie's second day in captivity was wearing on her nerves. The outlaws largely ignored her, except to give her food and water and allow her brief trips outside under guard to see to personal needs. She spent the time observing everything she could, noting which men seemed more alert and which appeared careless, where they kept their weapons, and how often they changed the guard. If an opportunity to escape presented itself, she wanted to be ready. As darkness fell and the men settled in for the night, she noticed that they were more relaxed than they had been the night before, confident that no one had followed them. They left only one man on guard, the tall one who had first grabbed her at the ranch, and he sat by the door nursing a bottle of whiskey. Natalie lay on her bunk, her wrists still bound, and tried to think of a way to use their overconfidence against them. Hours passed, and the cabin grew quiet except for the sound of snoring. The guard by the door had dozed off, his head nodding forward onto his chest. Natalie carefully sat up, moving as quietly as she could. If she could get to the door, maybe she could slip out and make a run for it. Her hands were tied, but her feet were free, and she was a fast runner. It was a long shot, but it might be her only chance. She had just swung her legs off the bunk when she heard a soft sound outside, like a footstep on gravel. She froze, her heart pounding. The guard did not stir, still lost in his drunken sleep. Then she heard it again, closer this time, and she realized someone was approaching the cabin. Wyatt had waited until well past midnight before making his move, giving the outlaws time to fall into deep sleep. He approached the cabin on foot, having left Red tied securely a quarter-mile back in the trees. He moved silently, a skill he had learned from an old Apache tracker years ago, placing each foot carefully and avoiding anything that might make noise. He reached the cabin wall and pressed himself against it, listening. He could hear snoring from inside and the occasional shift of someone moving in sleep. Carefully, he moved along the wall to the window, which was just an opening covered with oiled paper. He peeled back a corner and peered inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light from the dying fire. He counted 5 men sleeping in various bunks and on the floor, and 1 man slumped by the door. Then he saw her, Natalie, sitting on a bunk near the back wall, her face pale in the firelight and her wrists bound in front of her. Relief flooded through him. She was alive and appeared unharmed. Now, he just had to get her out. He moved to the door, which was made of rough planks held together with iron straps. It would creak if he tried to open it, he was sure of that. He needed another way. He moved back to the window and carefully worked at the oiled paper, peeling it away from the frame as quietly as he could. It came away in sections, and soon he had an opening large enough to slip through. He pulled himself up and through the window, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid making any sound. His boots touched the floor inside, and he froze, waiting to see if anyone had heard. The snoring continued undisturbed, and the guard by the door did not move. Wyatt let out a slow breath and moved toward Natalie's bunk. She saw him coming, and her eyes went wide with shock and something that might have been hope. He held a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, and she nodded. He reached her side and knelt down, pulling a knife from his boot. He cut through the ropes binding her wrists with a few quick sawing motions, and she rubbed her wrists, wincing at the pain of blood rushing back into her hands. He leaned close and whispered directly into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Can you walk?" She nodded. "Follow me. Stay quiet." He took her hand, and she was surprised by how steady and strong his grip felt, how it seemed to calm some of the fear racing through her. They moved together toward the window, stepping carefully around the sleeping men. They were almost there when one of the outlaws, the one with the scar, suddenly stirred and sat up, his eyes blinking in confusion. For a split second, nobody moved. Then the outlaw opened his mouth to shout, and Wyatt moved faster than Natalie had ever seen anyone move. He crossed the space in 2 strides and struck the man hard across the jaw, and the outlaw crumpled back onto his bunk, unconscious. But the damage was done. The movement and the thud of the man falling had woken the others. "Go!" Wyatt said urgently, pushing Natalie toward the window. "Go now!" She did not argue. She grabbed the window frame and pulled herself up and through, dropping down on the other side and landing hard on the ground. Behind her, she could hear shouting and cursing as the outlaws woke fully and realized what was happening. A gunshot rang out, deafeningly loud in the night air, and she screamed. But then Wyatt was there, coming through the window after her, and he grabbed her hand again. "Run!" They ran together into the darkness, and behind them, she could hear the cabin door banging open and men shouting. More gunshots cracked through the night, and she heard bullets whizzing past, too close for comfort. Wyatt led her through the rocks and trees with sure steps, even in the darkness, and she followed blindly, trusting him completely because she had no other choice. They reached his horse, and he practically threw her up into the saddle before swinging up behind her. He kicked Red into a gallop, and they took off through the night, with the shouts of the outlaws growing fainter behind them. Natalie clung to the saddle horn, feeling Wyatt's arms on either side of her as he controlled the horse, his body solid and protective behind her. They rode hard for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes or so, before Wyatt finally slowed Red to a walk. They were deep in the forest now, far from the canyon, and the only sounds were the horses breathing and the rustle of wind through the trees. Natalie realized she was shaking, the adrenaline draining out of her and leaving her weak. "Are you hurt?" Wyatt asked, his voice low and concerned. "No," she managed. "No, I am fine. They did not hurt me." "Good. That is good." She could hear the relief in his voice. "We need to keep moving, put more distance between us and them, but Red needs to rest soon. We will find a place to hide and wait for daylight." "Who are you?" Natalie asked, suddenly realizing that she had no idea who this man was, or why he had risked his life to save her. "Wyatt Fletcher, madam. I work ranches in the area. Met you a couple of times before, though I do not expect you to remember." But she did remember, suddenly and vividly, the cowboy with the kind eyes who had brought horses to her father's ranch, who had spoken to her like she was an equal rather than just a rancher's daughter to be patronized. "You came after me," she said, her voice wondering. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel the rise and fall of his chest against her back as he breathed. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he finally said. "Your father would have come himself if he were not hurt, and his men were needed at the ranch. Somebody had to." "Thank you," she said, and her voice broke a little. "Thank you for saving me." "We are not safe yet," he said. "But we will be, I promise you that." They rode on through the darkness, and despite everything, despite the danger they were still in and the exhaustion weighing on her, Natalie felt safer than she had in 2 days. There was something about Wyatt Fletcher, something solid and dependable, that made her believe his promise. He would get her home. Somehow, she knew it with absolute certainty. They found shelter as dawn was breaking, a small cave set into a hillside that was well hidden by brush and trees. Wyatt helped Natalie down from the horse, and then led Red inside the cave, which was just big enough for the 3 of them. He unsaddled the horse and rubbed him down with a blanket from his pack, giving the animal some grain and water from the canteen. Natalie sank down against the cave wall, her legs finally giving out. Now that they had stopped moving, every ache and pain from the past 2 days seemed to catch up with her all at once. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, her body was bruised from being manhandled and from the hard ride, and she was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. Wyatt finished with Red and then came to sit beside her, keeping his rifle across his lap and his eyes on the cave entrance. He pulled some dried beef from his pack and offered it to her. "You should eat something. I know it is not much, but it will help." She took the food and chewed mechanically, forcing herself to swallow, even though she was not sure she could taste anything. "Will they follow us?" she asked. "Probably," Wyatt said honestly. "But we have a good head start, and I have been covering our trail as best I can. By the time they figure out which direction we went, we will be long gone." "Where are we going?" "There is a settlement about half a day's ride from here, place called Greeley." We can rest there, get you cleaned up and fed properly, and send word to your father. Then we will figure out the safest way to get you home." Natalie nodded, then said quietly, "Those men, they wanted ransom. They were going to make my father pay." "Men like that always want something," Wyatt said, his voice hard. "Money, power, does not matter. They take what they want and hurt people doing it. But they did not get what they wanted this time." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since the rescue. In the growing light of dawn, she could see the dirt and sweat on his face, the tension in his jaw, the alertness in his eyes as he watched for any sign of danger. He had risked everything to save her, a woman he barely knew, and he was still risking his life to keep her safe. Something shifted in her chest, a feeling she could not quite name. "You should rest," Wyatt said, noticing her gaze. "I will keep watch. We will head out in a few hours." "What about you? You must be exhausted." "I will be fine. I have gone longer without sleep before." He smiled at her then, a small, tired smile that somehow made him look younger. "Besides, I can rest when we get you somewhere safe." Natalie wanted to argue, but her body was demanding sleep, and she knew she would not make it much further without rest. She leaned back against the cave wall and closed her eyes, and within minutes, she was asleep. Wyatt watched her sleep, her face finally relaxed and peaceful, and felt something tighten in his chest. He had told her he came after her because it was the right thing to do, and that was true, but it was not the whole truth. He had come after her because the thought of her being hurt or worse had been unbearable, because in those 2 brief meetings, she had made an impression on him that he had not been able to shake. He barely knew her, but he wanted to know her better. He wanted to hear her laugh and see her smile and learn what made her happy. He wanted things he had no right to want, not yet, maybe not ever. But first, he had to get her home safe. Everything else could wait. They stayed in the cave until mid-morning, both of them sleeping in shifts while Red rested and grazed on the grass near the cave entrance. When they finally set out again, Wyatt felt more alert, and Natalie looked better, some color back in her face. They rode at a steady pace, Wyatt keeping them to game trails and less obvious routes, always watching their back trail for any sign of pursuit. As they rode, they talked, their voices low and easy. Natalie told him about growing up on the ranch, about how her mother had died of pneumonia during a hard winter, and how she had learned to take over her mother's duties. She spoke of her father's pride in the ranch, and his determination to build something lasting, and Wyatt could hear the love and respect in her voice. In turn, Wyatt told her about his own childhood, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 12 and being taken in by a rancher who taught him everything about horses and cattle and living off the land. He spoke of the years he had spent drifting from ranch to ranch, never quite feeling like he belonged anywhere, always moving on when the restlessness got too strong. "Do you ever want to settle down?" Natalie asked. "Have a place of your own?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think about it sometimes. Would be nice to have something that was mine, something I built with my own hands. But ranching takes money, and I have never been good at saving up. Always seems like something comes along that needs the money more." "You are a good man, Wyatt Fletcher," Natalie said softly. He glanced back at her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. "Just doing what anyone would do." "No," she said firmly, "not anyone. You risked your life for me, and you did not have to. That makes you better than most." He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But her words stayed with him, warming something inside his chest that had been cold for a long time. They reached Greeley by late afternoon, a small but growing settlement with a main street lined with shops and a church at one end. Wyatt took them straight to the doctor's office, insisting that Natalie be looked over despite her protests that she was fine. The doctor, an older man named Harrison, examined her wrists and the bruises on her arms and declared that she would heal just fine with rest and good food. Wyatt paid the doctor from his own pocket and then took Natalie to the boarding house, where he got her a room and arranged for a hot bath and a meal to be brought up. The boarding house owner, a motherly woman named Mrs. Patterson, clucked over Natalie like a hen with a chick, promising to take good care of her. "What about you?" Natalie asked Wyatt as Mrs. Patterson led her toward the stairs. "Where will you be?" "I will get a room here too, just down the hall," Wyatt said. "I am not going anywhere, I promise. You are safe now." She nodded, and he could see the exhaustion weighing on her again, now that the immediate danger had passed. "Mrs. Patterson took her upstairs, and Wyatt went to the telegraph office to send word to Nathan Morgan that his daughter was safe. Then he got himself a room, finally allowed himself to relax just a little, and collapsed on the bed, asleep before his head fully hit the pillow. Natalie woke the next morning, feeling more human than she had in days. The hot bath the night before had eased her aching muscles, and the food and sleep had restored some of her strength. She dressed in the clean clothes Mrs. Patterson had lent her, a simple dress of blue calico, and braided her hair neatly. When she looked in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized herself. The haunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by something else, something that looked almost like hope. She went downstairs to find Wyatt already up and eating breakfast in the dining room. He stood when he saw her, his manners automatic, and pulled out a chair for her. "How are you feeling?" "Much better," she said honestly. "I think I might actually survive this." He smiled, a real smile this time, that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. "I never doubted it for a second." They ate together, and Natalie found herself watching him, noticing small things. The way he listened when she spoke, giving her his full attention. The way he handled his knife and fork, rough hands that could nevertheless be gentle. The way he seemed to fill the space around him with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with simply knowing who he was. After breakfast, Wyatt told her that he had received a reply to the telegram, and that Nathan Morgan was already on his way to Greeley with several ranch hands. They would arrive sometime the next day, weather permitting. Until then, Wyatt suggested they stay in town and rest, let their guard down a little, now that they were among people in relative safety. They spent the day exploring Greeley, walking the main street, and stopping in at various shops. Wyatt bought Natalie a new hat to replace the one she had lost during the kidnapping, a pretty thing with a blue ribbon that matched her borrowed dress. She protested that he did not need to spend his money on her, but he waved off her objections. "Consider it a gift," he said. "You have been through hell these past few days. You deserve something nice." As they walked, Natalie found herself acutely aware of Wyatt's presence beside her, the way people in town nodded to him respectfully, and how he seemed to know everyone, despite claiming to be just passing through. She realized that he was the kind of man who made an impression wherever he went, not through bluster or showiness, but through simple decency and quiet strength. That evening, they sat together on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sun set over the plains. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the air was finally beginning to cool after the heat of the day. Natalie felt more at peace than she had in a long time, and she realized with a start that it was not just because the ordeal was over. It was because of the man sitting beside her. "Wyatt," she said softly, and he turned to look at her. "What will you do after my father comes? Will you go back to Fort Collins with us?" "I figure I will see you home safe. Make sure you are settled," he said. "After that, I have a job waiting for me over in Wyoming, cattle drive that is supposed to leave in 2 weeks. Something cold settled in Natalie's stomach at the thought of him leaving. "Of course. You have your own life to get back to." "But maybe," he said, and she heard something tentative in his voice, something almost vulnerable. "Maybe I could come back through Fort Collins after the drive. Check in, make sure you were doing all right." She looked at him, and in the fading light, she could see the hope and uncertainty in his eyes. He was asking her something without actually asking, and suddenly her heart was pounding. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." He smiled then, that wonderful smile that transformed his whole face, and reached over to take her hand. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle, and she found herself threading her fingers through his, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had been shaken to its foundations. They sat there together as the stars began to come out, not talking much, just being present with each other, and Natalie thought that maybe, just maybe, something good had come out of the nightmare after all. Nathan Morgan arrived in Greeley the next afternoon with 4 of his best ranch hands and a wagon. He swept Natalie into a crushing hug the moment he saw her, and she clung to him, feeling tears sting her eyes for the first time since the ordeal began. He held her for a long time, and when he finally pulled back, his own eyes were wet. "I thought I had lost you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "When those bastards took you, I thought that was it. I would never see you again." "I am fine, Papa," Natalie said, "thanks to Wyatt." Nathan turned to Wyatt, who had been standing back to give them space. The older man extended his hand, and Wyatt shook it firmly. "I owe you a debt I can never repay, Fletcher. You brought my daughter back to me when I could not. That is something I will never forget." "Just glad I could help, sir," Wyatt said. Nathan studied him for a moment, and Natalie wondered what her father saw. Whatever it was, it seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded. "You will ride back to the ranch with us. Stay as long as you want. Any job you want on my ranch is yours for the asking." "I appreciate that, Mr. Morgan, but I have a job waiting for me in Wyoming." "After that, then, the offer stands whenever you are ready." They left Greeley the next morning, a much larger and safer group than the desperate flight that had brought Natalie and Wyatt there. The journey back to Fort Collins took 2 full days, and Natalie found herself riding beside Wyatt for most of it, the two of them falling naturally into conversation and comfortable silences. She learned more about him during those 2 days, small details that painted a picture of a man who was fundamentally decent and honest, who worked hard and valued loyalty above almost everything else. And she realized, somewhere on that journey home, that she was falling in love with him. It was not the slow, gentle falling that she had always imagined love would be. It was fast and fierce, like a river in spring flood, sweeping her along whether she wanted it to or not. Every time he looked at her, every time he smiled or laughed at something she said, every time his hand brushed against hers as they rode, she felt it more strongly. She was falling in love with Wyatt Fletcher, and the knowledge both terrified and exhilarated her. They reached the Morgan Ranch on a warm afternoon, and Natalie was surprised by how good it felt to be home. The barn had been repaired, the damage from the fire already being set right by the efficient ranch hands, and the house looked just as it always had, solid and welcoming. She dismounted in the yard, and several of the hands came over to welcome her back, their faces showing genuine relief and happiness to see her safe. That evening, Nathan insisted on a celebration dinner, inviting all the ranch hands to eat in the main house. It was crowded and loud and wonderful, and Natalie found herself laughing for the first time in what felt like forever. Wyatt sat beside her at the long table, and she was keenly aware of his presence, of the way he seemed to fit naturally into the chaos of the gathering. After dinner, when the hands had drifted back to the bunkhouse and Nathan had retired to his study to go over some papers, Natalie and Wyatt found themselves alone on the front porch once again. The night was clear and cool, and the stars overhead were brilliant in their multitude. "I leave tomorrow," Wyatt said quietly. "Need to get to Wyoming, or I will miss the drive." Natalie felt her heart clench. She had known this was coming, but knowing did not make it any easier. "Will you really come back?" she asked. "After the drive?" He turned to face her, and in the lamplight spilling from the windows, she could see the intensity in his eyes. "I meant what I said before. I want to come back. I want to see you again, Natalie. These past few days with you, even with everything that happened, they have been some of the best days of my life. And I know that probably sounds crazy considering we were running for our lives, but it is true. I have never met anyone like you." Her breath caught in her throat. "I feel the same way," she said, "and I will be here waiting when you come back." He reached up and cupped her cheek with one hand, his thumb brushing gently across her skin. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice low and rough with emotion. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and he leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind if she wanted to. But she did not want to. She wanted this more than she could remember wanting anything. His lips met hers, gentle at first, almost tentative, and then more firmly as she responded. The kiss was everything a first kiss should be, sweet and tender and full of promise. And when they finally pulled apart, Natalie felt dizzy with it. "I will come back," Wyatt said, his forehead resting against hers. "I promise you, I will come back." "I will be counting the days," she whispered. He left at dawn the next morning, and Natalie stood in the yard watching him ride away until he was just a speck on the horizon and then nothing at all. She felt hollow inside, aching with his absence, but she also felt something else, hope. He would come back. She believed him with every fiber of her being. He would come back, and when he did, they would figure out what this thing between them was and where it could go. The weeks that followed were some of the longest of Natalie's life. She threw herself into the work of the ranch, helping her father with the accounts and riding out with the hands to check on the cattle and fences. She kept herself busy from sunup to sundown, but in the quiet moments, in the evenings when the work was done, she found herself thinking of Wyatt, wondering where he was, what he was doing, if he was thinking of her too. She received her first letter from him 6 weeks after he left, delivered by a rider passing through Fort Collins. It was not a long letter, just a few pages written in a neat, careful hand, but she treasured every word. He wrote about the cattle drive, about the long days in the saddle, and the challenges of moving several thousand head of cattle across rivers and through difficult terrain. He wrote about the other cowboys on the drive, the camaraderie, and the occasional conflicts. And he wrote about missing her, about thinking of her when he watched the stars at night and remembering their conversations on the porch. Natalie wrote back immediately, telling him about the ranch and her father's recovery from his injury and how the barn repairs were nearly complete. She told him about the small things, the foal that had been born in the spring, and the wildflowers blooming on the hills. And she told him, as honestly as she could put into words, how much she missed him, and how much she was looking forward to seeing him again. They exchanged several more letters over the following months, each one bringing them closer, despite the distance between them. Through those letters, Natalie learned more about Wyatt's dreams and fears, his hopes for the future, and the things that mattered to him. And she shared her own dreams with him, things she had never told anyone else, about wanting to expand the ranch and maybe start breeding horses, about wanting a partner who would see her as an equal rather than just a wife to be protected and sheltered. The cattle drive lasted 3 months, and when it was over, Wyatt collected his pay and immediately started the journey back to Fort Collins. He rode hard, stopping only when necessary, driven by a need to see Natalie again that had only grown stronger with time and distance. He had meant what he said in his letters. He missed her fiercely, and he had spent the long days on the trail thinking about what he wanted his future to look like. For the first time in his life, he did not want to keep drifting. He wanted to put down roots, build something lasting, and he wanted to do it with Natalie by his side. He arrived at the Morgan Ranch on a crisp autumn afternoon, the leaves on the cottonwoods turning gold and the air carrying the first hint of the coming winter. He rode into the yard just as the hands were coming in from their day's work, and one of them recognized him and called out a greeting. Natalie came out of the house at the sound of voices, and when she saw him, her face lit up with a joy so pure and unguarded that it took his breath away. She ran to him as he dismounted, and he caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet and holding her close. She buried her face in his neck, and he could feel her trembling. "You came back," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "You really came back." "I told you I would," he said, setting her down gently but not letting go. "I always keep my promises." She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I missed you so much." "I missed you too," he said, and then he was kissing her, right there in the yard, with half the ranch hands watching, and he did not care one bit. She kissed him back with a fervor that matched his own, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Nathan Morgan came out onto the porch, and Wyatt could see the knowing smile on the older man's face. "Welcome back, Fletcher. I see you found what you were looking for." "Yes, sir," Wyatt said, his arm still around Natalie's waist. "I believe I have." That evening, after dinner, Nathan invited Wyatt into his study for a private conversation. Wyatt went, feeling nervous for the first time in longer than he could remember. Nathan poured them both a whiskey and gestured for Wyatt to sit. "I am going to speak plainly," Nathan said. "My daughter is in love with you. That is clear to anyone with eyes. And unless I am very much mistaken, you feel the same way about her." "I do, sir," Wyatt said without hesitation. "I love her. I think I started falling in love with her the moment I heard she had been taken. And these past months apart have only made me more certain." Nathan nodded as if this was what he had expected to hear. "Natalie is all I have left in this world. Her happiness matters more to me than anything else. So, I need to know what your intentions are." Wyatt met the older man's gaze steadily. "I want to marry her, if she will have me. I want to build a life with her, right here on this land, if you will allow it. I know I do not have much to my name right now, just my horse and my gear and the money from the cattle drive. But I am a hard worker, and I am not afraid of starting from nothing. I will do whatever it takes to make her happy and give her the life she deserves." Nathan studied him for a long moment, and Wyatt forced himself not to fidget under the scrutiny. Finally, Nathan nodded. "I believe you, and I told you before that you could have any job on this ranch, and I meant it. But I am going to make you a better offer. You marry my daughter, and I will sign over the north section of the ranch to you, about 500 acres with good water and grazing. You can build your own place there, raise your own cattle or horses or whatever you want. It will be yours and Natalie's, to do with as you see fit." Wyatt felt his jaw drop slightly. "Sir, that is incredibly generous. I do not know what to say. Say yes, and then go ask my daughter to marry you. But I warn you, she has got a mind of her own, and will not say yes just because you asked. You will have to convince her." Wyatt grinned. "I think I am up for the challenge." He found Natalie out by the corral, watching the horses in the evening light. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and the smile that crossed her face made his heart skip a beat. He walked over to her and took her hands in his. "I spoke with your father," he said. "I know. He cornered you in his study. I was wondering when he would do that." She tilted her head, studying him. "What did he say?" "He asked me what my intentions were." "And what did you tell him?" "The truth," Wyatt said. He took a deep breath, suddenly more nervous than he had ever been, facing down an angry bull or a flooded river. "I told him that I love you, Natalie, that I have loved you since the moment I realized you were in danger, and that these months apart have only made me more certain. I told him I want to marry you, if you will have me. I know it is fast, and we have not known each other that long, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life." She was staring at him, her eyes wide, and her lips slightly parted in surprise. For a terrible moment, he thought he had misjudged, that he had moved too fast, and was about to have his heart broken. But then she smiled, a radiant smile that seemed to light up the whole world. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Wyatt Fletcher." Relief and joy flooded through him in equal measure. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, and she laughed with him, her arms around his neck. When he set her down, he kissed her, long and deep, pouring all of his love and hope and dreams for the future into that kiss. "Your father offered us land," he said when they finally broke apart. 500 acres on the north section. We can build our own place, start our own herd. It will be hard work, but we will do it together." "Together," Natalie echoed, and the words sounded like a promise. "I like the sound of that." They were married 6 weeks later in the church in Fort Collins, with the whole town turning out for the ceremony. Natalie wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit her, and carried a bouquet of autumn wildflowers. Wyatt wore his best suit, purchased new for the occasion with some of his savings, and stood at the altar feeling like the luckiest man alive. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Wyatt kissed his bride, there was not a dry eye in the church. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and enough food to feed an army. The ranch hands provided music, playing fiddles and guitars, and Wyatt danced with Natalie under the stars, holding her close and marveling at how his life had changed in just a few short months. As winter set in, they began work on their new house, with help from Nathan and the ranch hands. It was a modest place, just 4 rooms to start. But it was theirs. They worked side by side, Wyatt handling the heavy construction and Natalie making decisions about the layout and helping with everything from mixing mortar to painting walls. By the time spring arrived, the house was finished, and they moved in, spending their first night in their own home, wrapped in each other's arms in front of the fireplace. The first year of their marriage was hard work, but filled with joy. They started their own small herd of cattle, purchasing stock with Wyatt's savings and a loan from Nathan. They also bought several horses, and Natalie began the breeding program she had always dreamed of, with Wyatt's full support and encouragement. He never once treated her dreams as less important than his own, and she loved him all the more for it. By their first anniversary, Natalie was pregnant, and Wyatt was beside himself with excitement and nervousness. He fretted over her constantly, insisting she not lift anything heavy or work too hard, and she found his concern both endearing and occasionally annoying. But she could not be angry with him, not when she saw the love and wonder in his eyes every time he looked at her. Their son was born in the spring of 1880, a healthy, squalling baby boy with Wyatt's blue eyes and Natalie's dark hair. They named him Samuel, after Wyatt's father, and Wyatt held his son for the first time, with tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered, staring down at the tiny face. "Absolutely perfect." "He is ours," Natalie said, exhausted but happy. "Our family." As Samuel grew, the ranch prospered. Word spread about the quality of Natalie's horses, and buyers came from as far as Denver to purchase from them. Wyatt's cattle herd grew as well, and within 3 years, they had expanded their land by purchasing an adjacent section from a neighbor who was retiring. They built onto the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen, and hired their first ranch hand, a young man from town who was eager to learn the trade. 2 years after Samuel came a daughter they named Rose, who had Natalie's gray eyes and Wyatt's stubborn chin. She was followed 3 years later by another son, James, who was quiet and thoughtful even as a baby. Wyatt proved to be a wonderful father, patient and loving, teaching his children to ride almost as soon as they could walk and telling them stories in the evenings while Natalie prepared dinner. Nathan remained active on his own section of the ranch well into his 60s, finally slowing down only when a bout of pneumonia forced him to admit he was not as young as he used to be. He spent increasing amounts of time at Wyatt and Natalie's house, doting on his grandchildren and offering advice when asked, though he was careful never to interfere in how they ran their own operation. The outlaws who had kidnapped Natalie were eventually tracked down by a U.S. Marshal and his deputies several years later. Pike Garrison and 2 of his men were killed in the shootout that followed, while the others were captured and hanged for their crimes. When Wyatt heard the news, he felt a grim satisfaction, but found that he could not muster much emotion about it. That chapter of their lives seemed like a lifetime ago, and he was far more interested in the future than dwelling on the past. On their 10th anniversary, Wyatt took Natalie on a trip to Denver, their first real time away from the ranch and children since they had married. They stayed in a fine hotel and ate in restaurants and went to see a play, living like city folks for a few precious days. But what Natalie remembered most about that trip was the quiet evening they spent in their hotel room, just talking and being together without the demands of the ranch and children pulling at them. "Are you happy?" Wyatt asked her, as they sat together by the window watching the city lights. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Natalie said honestly. "There are hard days, of course, days when nothing goes right and I'm so tired I can barely stand. But I would not trade this life for anything. I have you, I have our children, I have work that I love. What more could I ask for?" "I feel the same way," Wyatt said, taking her hand and raising it to his lips. "Sometimes I think about that night I followed the trail of those outlaws, how I almost did not go, how I almost decided it was not my business. And then I wonder what my life would be like now if I had made that choice. I do not think I would have survived it, Natalie. Not really. You gave me a reason to stop drifting, a reason to put down roots and build something real. You gave me a home." She turned to him, seeing the emotion shining in his eyes. "We gave each other a home," she corrected gently. "That is what love is, I think. Building a home together, not just a house, but a life, a place where you belong completely." He kissed her then, and it was like the first kiss they had shared all those years ago on her father's porch, full of promise and hope and the certainty that they had found something rare and precious. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. There were droughts that tested their resolve and winters that were brutally hard. There were cattle lost to disease and horses injured and all the thousand small disasters that came with ranching. But there were also the good times, the moments of triumph and satisfaction. Watching Samuel grow into a fine young man who loved the land as much as they did. Seeing Rose develop a talent for training horses that surpassed even her mother's. Marveling at James's quick mind and his love of books. Knowing he would probably choose a different path than ranching and being proud of him for it. Nathan passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, surrounded by his family. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch he had built, and Wyatt gave the eulogy, speaking of a man who had taken a chance on a drifting cowboy and given him not just land and opportunity, but a family. There was not a dry eye at the funeral, and Natalie leaned against Wyatt's strength, grateful beyond words that he was there to help shoulder the grief. They merged the 2 sections of the ranch after Nathan's death, creating one of the largest and most prosperous operations in northern Colorado. Samuel took over managing the cattle operation, while Rose handled the horses, and Wyatt and Natalie found themselves in the roles of advisors and planners, still active but no longer bearing the full weight of the daily work. On their 25th anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party, inviting everyone from miles around. The house and yard were packed with people, and there was music and dancing and enough food to feed the whole county. Wyatt and Natalie stood together watching the festivities, his arm around her waist, and marveled at how their life had unfolded. 25 years, Natalie said, shaking her head. Where did the time go? I do not know, Wyatt said, but I would do it all again in a heartbeat, every single moment. Even the scary parts, the running for our lives through the night. He turned to face her, his blue eyes still as bright and clear as they had been when he was 24. Especially those parts, because they led me to you, and you are the best thing that ever happened to me. She reached up and cupped his face, feeling the weathered skin and the lines that time and sun had etched there. He was not the young cowboy anymore, and she was not the frightened woman he had rescued. They had both changed, grown, been shaped by the years and the life they had built together. But the love between them had not diminished. If anything, it had deepened, becoming something solid and unshakable, a foundation upon which everything else in their lives rested. I love you, Wyatt Fletcher, she said. I love you too, Natalie Fletcher, he replied. Always have, always will. Samuel married at 23, bringing home a sweet young woman named Caroline from Denver, and they gave Wyatt and Natalie their first grandchild a year later, a boy they named Nathan after his great-grandfather. Rose married a few years later to a horse trainer she met at a stock show, and they settled on a piece of land adjacent to the ranch. Even James, who had gone to university in the East and become a lawyer, eventually returned to Colorado with his wife and children, unable to stay away from the land that had shaped him. As Wyatt and Natalie moved into their 60s, they finally began to slow down, spending more time on the porch watching the sunset and less time in the saddle. They had earned their rest, everyone agreed, and they had built something that would last long after they were gone. The ranch was thriving, their children were happy and successful, and their grandchildren were growing up knowing the value of hard work and family. On a warm summer evening in 1910, 32 years after the night that had changed everything, Wyatt and Natalie sat together on the porch of the house they had built with their own hands. Their eldest grandson was out in the corral working with a young horse, and they could hear the sound of children's laughter from somewhere around the back of the house. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? Natalie asked, her hand in Wyatt's as it so often was. If those outlaws had not taken me, if you had not come after me? Sometimes, Wyatt admitted, but not in a regretful way. More just marveling at how one moment can change the course of an entire life. If I had not been in that saloon that night, if I had not heard about the attack, if I had decided it was not my concern, everything would be different. I would have missed out on the greatest adventure of my life. Adventure? Natalie laughed. Is that what you call 32 years of marriage and raising 3 children and running a ranch? Absolutely, Wyatt said with complete seriousness. The best kind of adventure. The kind where you wake up every morning not knowing exactly what the day will bring, but knowing that you have someone by your side to face it with. That is what you have given me. Natalie, a life full of meaning and purpose and love. I was just drifting before you, moving from place to place with no real direction. You gave me a home, you gave me a family, you gave me a reason to be a better man. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, unchanged after all these years. You gave me the same things. Before you, I was so focused on just surviving, on keeping the ranch going after Mama died. I forgot what it was like to dream, to hope for something more than just getting through each day. You reminded me that life is meant to be lived, not just endured. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, the same colors it had been that first evening they had sat together on her father's porch. 2 people who barely knew each other but were already falling in love. The years had been kind to them in many ways and hard in others, but through it all they had faced everything together. 2 people who had become one through choice and commitment and the deep, abiding love that had only grown stronger with time. Samuel came up to the porch as the stars began to appear, Caroline and little Nathan with him. "We are heading home, Pa, Ma," he said. "Thank you for dinner." "Any time," Natalie said, rising to hug her son and daughter-in-law and to ruffle her grandson's hair. "You know you are always welcome." After they left, Wyatt pulled Natalie back down beside him. "I hope they have what we have," he said quietly. "I hope all our children find what we found." "They will," Natalie said with confidence. "We taught them what real love looks like, how it is built through the everyday moments, through working together and supporting each other and choosing each other every single day. They know what matters. As full darkness fell and the stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss and their wedding and every important moment in between, Wyatt and Natalie remained on the porch, unwilling to go inside just yet. There was something perfect about this moment, something worth savoring. "If you could go back," Wyatt asked suddenly, "back to that night when I pulled you through the window of that outlaw cabin, and if you could see everything that was going to happen, all the years and the work and the joy and the grief, would you still say yes when I asked you to marry me?" Natalie did not even have to think about it. "In a heartbeat," she said. "I would say yes 1,000 times over. You are my home, Wyatt Fletcher. You always have been, from that very first moment you took my hand in the darkness and promised to keep me safe. And you have kept that promise every day since." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head, and she felt his chest rise and fall with a deep, contented breath. "And I will keep on keeping it," he said, "for as long as I have breath in my body. That is my promise to you, Natalie. Always." The years that followed continued to be good to them. They became great-grandparents, watching their legacy grow and expand in ways they had never imagined. The ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's management, and Rose's horse breeding program became known throughout the West, with people coming from as far as Texas and Montana to purchase her stock. James's law practice flourished, and he never forgot his roots, often taking on cases for ranchers and settlers who could not afford fancy lawyers from the city. Wyatt's health remained strong well into his 70s, though he finally had to admit that he could no longer sit a horse the way he used to. Natalie developed arthritis in her hands, which pained her because it made it harder to do the detailed work she loved, but she learned to adapt, teaching her granddaughters the skills she could no longer execute herself with the same precision. They celebrated their 50th anniversary in 1928, surrounded by more than 100 people, children and grandchildren, and great-grandchildren and friends from across the territory. Someone had brought a camera, one of those newfangled things that could capture a moment in time, and they took a photograph of Wyatt and Natalie standing together in front of the house, his arm around her shoulders, and both of them smiling at each other, rather than at the camera. That photograph would hang in the ranch house for generations, a testament to a love that had endured and flourished across half a century. Wyatt passed away peacefully in the winter of 1931, in his sleep with Natalie beside him, just as he had always wanted. He was 77 years old and had lived a full, rich life. They buried him next to Nathan on the hill overlooking the ranch, and the funeral drew people from hundreds of miles away, all of them coming to pay respects to a man who had been respected and loved by everyone who knew him. Natalie grieved deeply, but not hopelessly. She had had 53 wonderful years with the man she loved, and she carried those memories like treasures in her heart. She remained active on the ranch for several more years, still offering advice and wisdom to her children and grandchildren, still sharp and capable even as her body began to fail. She passed away in the spring of 1935, on a beautiful morning when the wildflowers were blooming on the hills just like they had been the day she married Wyatt. She was sitting on the porch in her favorite chair, a quilt that she had made years ago wrapped around her shoulders, and she simply closed her eyes and did not open them again. They said it looked like she was smiling, like she had seen something wonderful at the very end. They buried her beside Wyatt, and the entire county seemed to turn out for the funeral. Samuel gave the eulogy, speaking of a woman who had been strong and brave and loving, who had built a legacy that would endure for generations. He spoke of how she had loved his father with a devotion that had been absolute, and how their love had been an example to everyone who knew them of what marriage could be at its best. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, and the story of how it all began became family legend. Great-great-grandchildren who never knew Wyatt and Natalie grew up hearing the tale of the night the outlaws dragged her into the darkness, and how a cowboy followed their trail and fought for her freedom, and how that act of courage and love had created something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. The house they built still stands, renovated and expanded, but fundamentally the same, and the photograph from their 50th anniversary still hangs in a place of honor. Visitors to the ranch, even those with no connection to the family, often find themselves drawn to that photograph, to the way the two people in it are looking at each other with such obvious love and contentment. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the sun is setting and the air is cool and sweet, people swear they can see two figures sitting on the porch, an older man and woman holding hands and watching the sky turn colors. Nobody knows if it is just tricks of light or imagination or something more, but it does not really matter. What matters is that the love Wyatt and Natalie shared left an imprint on that place, a sense of peace and belonging that anyone who visits can feel. Their story is one of courage and love, of two people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful and lasting. It is a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best ones, that being willing to take a risk for someone else can change not just their life, but your own in ways you never imagined. From the terror of that night when outlaws dragged a young woman into darkness, came a love story that spanned more than 5 decades, produced 3 children who all found their own happiness, and created a legacy that continues to this very day. It is a story worth telling and retelling, a story that proves that true love, the kind built on respect and partnership and daily choice, can endure anything that life throws at it. And in the end, that is what Wyatt and Natalie would have wanted to be remembered for. Not just that he saved her life that night so long ago, but that they saved each other in all the ways that truly mattered. They gave each other a home, a family, a purpose, and a love that death itself could not diminish. They lived fully and loved completely, and they left the world better than they found it. Their story is complete, their journey finished, but the impact of their love continues to ripple outward through the generations, a testament to the power of courage, devotion, and the choice to build something beautiful together out of even the darkest beginnings. They found each other in the Wild West of 1878, 2 souls who were meant to be together, and they created a legacy that will last forever.